Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here, and I'm curious. I know that some people log in remotely to these sessions, but just so I get a general sense, how many of you are faculty? Most everybody, okay. And then residents and fellows? Okay. Which one should I dismiss? No, just kidding. So in terms of disclosures, just so you know, any pictures I just stole from the internet. I'm so sorry. And then the work of the framework that I'll present to you today is really a very collaborative academic project that I've been contributing to for about 4 years now with Tyra Feinstad and Addie McClintock, who are from General Internal Medicine, Judy Powells from Family Practice, Eileen Klein from Pediatric Emergency Medicine, and Susan Johnson from the GME office, which has just been an amazing collaboration to think about how can we improve the feedback environment at University of Washington. Also, just so that you know, I am on the Internal Medicine Review Committee for the ACGME. So that framework definitely does play a role in how I think about addressing issues when you think about feedback conversations and how to talk to trainees. I have some objectives, most of which are pretty simple. I want to talk about different kinds of feedback, or that there are them, and I really am interested in focusing on the idea of why you might want to become somebody who seeks feedback yourself. I think this is something that is underappreciated for faculty. We go up through this hierarchical process, we get a lot of feedback, we get good at our jobs, and then here we are, assistants and associates and full professors, really not having a very good sense always of what we're doing well in and how we can get better. What has really driven this project for me is the idea that we can use feedback to make our culture a better one for trainees and a better one for ourselves, and also to help our trainees not just get better at the small thing that you're giving them feedback on, but to help them figure out how is it that I can self-identify better areas that I need to improve, and ways that I can improve my resources with respect to getting better at my job. And then I'll tell you about our framework. So yeah, this week my husband got a new minivan, or we got a new minivan. He's totally into minivans. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting when we did this test drive was they have this thing called automatic cruise control. And it has these little sensors that go out and figures out where the line is, and then you can see if you kind of let go of the wheel that that you can drift a little bit, and it'll give you some tactile feedback, which I think is important in terms of how we think about surveying our environment with respect to how we're getting feedback from people as both learners and feedback givers. And but then sometimes if you're really drifting over, you really do need to grab the wheel. So that's something we always have to keep in mind in the medical environment, is that if you're in a circumstance where it's all about patient safety, then the feedback kind of falls by the wayside a little bit. So when I walked in here today, there was a woman who stopped and asked me what I was talking on. And I told her feedback, and she said, "Oh, feedback, what kind?" And I was completely stymied by the question, which is a little bit embarrassing. And so when I paused to think about it, she said, "Oh, verbal feedback?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, that's great. Everyone in this institution needs to come to this." And then she left. But it did make me think, when you think about, when you guys who came to this lecture, anybody willing to volunteer to me what they think feedback is? Cindy's going to have to, because she's in the front row, and I only know Cindy and Brian's names. I'm so sorry.
So, I mean, I think of feedback as something that you can give to either a peer or to a student or trainee, where you monitor how they're progressing and you see if they're veering off track and try to get them back on track with what you share with them.
That I totally agree. So she thinks of feedback is something that you give to people. It can be to peers, it can be to trainees, and it's something to kind of give you a sense of where you are with respect to your learning goals or the environment. Did I say that right? Okay. And it's true, you know, I think of feedback as a teaching method. It's one of many. And we know that from studies, not so much in the medical education environment, but in the education environment overall, that feedback is one of the one of the teaching methods that creates the most improvement in outcomes. Okay, and those are things like if you look at what's the teacher-student ratio, and how much you do testing, and what's the socioeconomic status of the kiddo that you're looking at. Feedback is really very important with respect to people making progress. It is a good way to change behavior and attitudes and knowledge. And, you know, a lot of our work was influenced not just by what was published in medical education, but also what people were writing about in business and in organizational psychology literature. And I have to admit that I was extremely blown away by this book, this Thanks for the Feedback book. And these two authors were part of the Harvard Negotiation Project, who wrote that very famous book, Getting to Yes, that's about conflict negotiation. And this is an incredibly accessible book, and it's actually about how to become better at yourself as a feedback seeker, and how to kind of remove some of the defensiveness we have about getting feedback and hearing criticism. And it's a very, very useful book. But one of the frameworks that they have that I loved was this idea is that feedback can be divided into 3 different major types. And one type is coaching. And that's really the feedback that I'm going to focus on the most today. The coaching style feedback where you have a specific learning goal and somebody wants to get better at it, or you want somebody to get better at it, or you want to get better at it. There's also what we think of feedback that's appreciation, which is, you know, you did a great job, or I really appreciated that you stayed late this night. And for a long time, I actually kind of thought this was a no big deal area, but I honestly think that in terms of the workplace environment, appreciation can be a huge factor with respect to how happy you and your colleagues and your staff are. And is something that we should pay a lot of attention to too. And people have different ways that they appreciate appreciation. Like some people really like to be verbally recognized. Some people like it when you go out of your way to help them with things. They're very service oriented. And so this is a really interesting area that I don't have time to cover in any more detail. And then the other kind of feedback is this evaluation or summative feedback. And this gets very, very interlinked and conflated in our medical environment, partially because the same people that are giving the coaching feedback are often filling out the evaluations. And this is a big tension in our work as both attendings and also often residents and fellows who are giving feedback to other people too. And it's hard to kind of sort out this issue because sometimes when what we want is something like, I want a direct idea of am I reading enough slides for a day? Forgive me for my examples if they don't meet the mark at all. Or, you know, did I take that stitch right? Did I, you know, take too long to close in that generator change? I have to give the electrophysiology ones because those I'm familiar with. Versus, you know, compared to a group of your peers, you're really progressing very rapidly in this area. But this is an area for opportunity. So that would be more of an evaluation. And if you give people coaching feedback when they want evaluation and vice versa, or appreciation when they want something else, they don't feel like you've given them feedback because you're not giving them what they need. So you have to think hard about how to parse this kind of language and what your trainees are asking you for. So this is a definition of feedback I really like. It's from this Boot-and-Malloy book, which is a really nice review of feedback in the medical education environment. A process to obtain information about a comparison between a performance and a standard, with the intent to help improve performance. So what I like about this is the idea that it's not necessarily, although sometimes feedback can be a one-time thing or it can be part of a continued relationship. And that there's not just what you see and what you observe, but there's actually a standard. And we struggle with this all the time in medicine because there's not always a standard. Or it's kind of like well, other people's documentation is just more clear than yours. And I think as people who give feedback, this is why it's hard for us to give good and valuable feedback, is because it takes a lot of focus and a lot of meticulous thought to figure out what you should say to people and what your standard is and what your standard should be. And the intention I highlighted too, because I think that really one of the important things about giving feedback is that the person who you're giving feedback to, that they understand the reason why you're giving them that is not to be critical or mean, but for them to understand that you are in their corner and you want the best for them in terms of their professional development. So I think everyone in this room knows this, like what happens if you don't give feedback. It's, you know, trainees don't know when they're doing a good job, if they're doing a good job and they should keep doing it, or if they're doing a bad job and in what ways. And so it's really very central to supporting professional development and intellectual skills and cognitive skills. And then in general, I've hit on these already just a little bit with respect to when I think about what you really need in your personal feedback system, is you need to think about the specifics of the feedback itself we'll talk about. You need to think about the learner, the feedback seeker. You need to think about yourself and the relationship. And kind of how, in terms of being the coach, you need to think about how are you presenting, like what is your coaching style? Just like many of you might have thought about, you know, what is your style with respect to when you go and give talks or when you talk to patients, and because we all have different styles that we've adapted. And then also, I think importantly, the culture, which is really hard to change, but definitely influences how we have these conversations. And with respect to the feedback itself, just like people think about SMART goals, I think a feedback can be SMART too. It's going to need to be specific. It's going to need to be on something that's discrete or measurable. It should be balanced. It should be attainable. You know, it's not one of those things where you can say, I think a lot of people who have had bad feedback experiences, a lot of those are directed very personally, like, you know, oh, you know, you look sloppy, as opposed to, it's helpful in our department, we wear suit and ties, or something that's not personality related. And in fact, it's really good to avoid these areas where you're talking about the person at all, and think about giving your feedback in the structure of formats that have to do with the professional development. And I'll talk about that a little bit later with the scenarios. You want your feedback to be, if you can, if the person actually, it has to be relevant, obviously, to adult learners, or they're not going to pay attention to it because they have a lot of other things to pay attention to in our environments. But also if it's requested, so you want to encourage your learners to be feedback seekers. And then also timely, which is I think the thing that we all struggle the most because we're pulled in so many different directions. And the other thing that you learn about feedback in terms of what makes it effective and useful is that it's most effective if it's linked to specific goals, even more so if those goals are generated by the learner, and very useful if you can link it to action plans, which I think is the next hardest part, or maybe the most hardest part, because we are not very good at this. If we see somebody who's a struggling learner or a learner who's struggling in a particular area, figuring out how you're going to help them get better at that can be very, very challenging. Like, it's one thing if it's a deficit of medical knowledge. You can suggest things for them to read, and that's kind of the easiest. But if it's something like their body language and communication, or how meticulously they think through problem solving, those are much more difficult things to help people improve on, and that's where our challenges really lie. The other thing that's important about it is that feedback tends to be more effective when it's delivered by a respected either a coach or attending or a respected colleague. And there are different ways that you can be respected. I talked a little bit about kind of your coaching or your attending personality with trainees, and one of them is the idea that you're approachable and warm. And learners will gravitate towards seeking feedback to that sort of thing. But there's another personality that is just as useful with respect to feedback direction, and that tends to be attendings who are very clear and focused and not personal about how they deliver feedback. And that, I think, fits in very well for a lot of us with respect to medicine. As long as we can have those standards and we stay and we stick to, this is the framework that I'm thinking about the areas that you should improve in. And then is presented frequently. I should mention that too. So feedback-seeking behavior, I've harped on this a little bit, and I just want to let you know that in both the medical environment and in the business environment, people who seek feedback have improved work performance, more creativity, they have higher job satisfaction, and they also have, in the business world, increased adaption or socialization, which I don't have any evidence for this, but I suspect that this has to do with, in the medical environment, it might help with professional identity formation, which is something all of our trainees and even us are doing all of the time, which is really important psychological work for when we're doing our training. A supportive context is really also important in terms of this, and that plays back to the culture, is what can we do to encourage our trainees and ourselves to seek feedback. Nobody has pens and papers. One person has a pen or paper. So in terms of habit development, if you want to develop a new habit, there are data that if you write that down as a goal. So if you would like to think about something that you could ask for feedback on, I invite you to write it down. And I also invite someone from the audience to give a suggestion. So an attending, is there an attending who's not Sindhu, who is willing to think, what kind of thing could I get feedback on? When was the last time you asked someone for feedback?
I would be pleased to answer the question, when did I ask for feedback?
All right.
That would be about 3 hours ago.
Excellent. But not to share what you asked for feedback on.
I asked for feedback about giving feedback.
Outstanding. Was it useful? I have mixed experiences with asking for feedback, particularly of trainees, I find. I try really hard to model it when I'm using my framework and say, oh, when we go in and talk to this patient, you let me know X if you think that I've communicated this well, or whatever it is I'm particularly interested in with that particular conversation. And I can tell you that my trainees are very likely to say, it was great. So I think sometimes we have some work to do to really make it clear that we're willing to hear explicit critical feedback. With respect to medical education and clinical clerkships, and this is stuff that's more on medical students than higher level trainees, but I think that it actually plays a role. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a goal orientation is, and that your trainee's goal orientation is really important with respect to whether people will seek feedback or not, on top of, I've already mentioned, the supervisory style of the attending. Trainees also pay a lot of attention to what the perceived costs are, as well as the benefits of the feedback. And these things will dovetail into whether people seek feedback in a particular environment or rotation. And how effective your feedback is contingent on how engaged. If your learner doesn't think that your feedback is worthwhile, they are not going to pay attention. This is a model that I think is really similar, but I think it's interesting because it also mentions the fact of the role that emotions can play in how we receive feedback, which is something that you have to pay attention to as both a feedback giver and seeker. So goal orientation. How many of you have heard or read Mindset by Carol Dweck? How many of those people are parents? Yeah, I think I read Mindset because it came up in one of my kids' school meetings or something like that. And so Carol Dweck has really popularized this idea in the popular literature that there are different kinds of mindsets. Mindsets are states, by the way. They're not fixed personality traits, and you can have one mindset in one area of your life and other mindsets in other areas of your life. And the idea is that if you have a fixed mindset, which is also called a performance-oriented mindset, you believe that your basic abilities, your talents, your skills are fixed traits, that you're kind of born with a certain amount, and that's that. And you can spend an awful lot of your time just trying to look smart and not fail. It's very difficult if you have a fixed mindset or a performance-oriented mindset to expose your vulnerabilities, because you are very used to being judged, and you are very often very judgmental about your own performance. And you can see that we see this all the time in medicine, right? Like I do this all the time. I don't want to admit in my cardiology division meeting that I don't know X, Y, or Z because people might think poorly of me. And it's very important in our environment that people do not think poorly of us. And that is contrasted to a growth mindset or a learning-oriented mindset where people with this mindset or having this mindset means that you believe that your abilities and your talents can be developed through effort. And that is really the key. And they don't necessarily think that everybody's the same, but they think that there's a role for improvement. And these are the people who are really excited by challenges. So your goal here is for yourself and your trainees to move yourself towards a growth or learning-oriented mindset. And ways in which you can do that that are mostly studied in university students and children are things like you'll hear a lot about praising effort rather than achievement. I think this is a crucial, really difficult cultural problem to handle in medicine because we're doing something really serious and there isn't a lot of room for mistakes. So it is very, very hard to negotiate the tension between I want people to admit when they don't know something so I can teach them that. I don't expect people to be perfect from the get-go because that is impossible. But on the other hand, I can't have anybody make a mistake anytime because it might hurt somebody. It's not very well reconcilable. And we have to find some way that we provide enough safety to trainees and ourselves that we can actually, admit when things did not go well in these ways, in certain ways, so that we can analyze it and improve performance. Psychological safety is also important with respect to teams. I don't know how many of you read that New York Times article sometime in the last year or two that looked at where Google reported on the results of their Project Aristotle, where they looked at high-performing teams, and they did huge amounts of analysis. Is it that you want your high-performing teams, do they all have to be extroverts? Do they have to go and party together? Do they just meet once a week? And they looked at tons and tons of personality characteristics. And what they found was that high-performing teams were incredibly varied. They could be any of those things. People who loved hanging out, people who didn't love hanging out, people who had things in common, who didn't have things in common. But what was really important for high performance of a team was that there was psychological safety, that members of the team felt like they could be wrong, they could admit mistakes, that they could throw out, that they could look dumb, that they could brainstorm crazy ideas, and that they felt safe, that they weren't going to be ridiculed, that they were going to have the respect of the rest of their team. And those teams really were much more effective than other teams. And I think that that's an aspect of this that we should pay attention to in our environment. So I think I sort of touched on this before that, if you, and I put learner in parentheses to I'm trying to remind me too that, we are all learners in this environment. So it's not just that we're talking about here, all us attendings, who are so great and we're finished and have learned all we need to learn, that there are rewards for ourselves to be more vulnerable and to think harder about ways in which we can improve too. And that what we really want from our learners is not just that they learn how to do X, Y, and Z, but they also learn the value of thinking hard about what it is that they need to do to get better. And that is throughout their entire career, right? These are the habits of mind that we want to be supporting in our environment. I'll give you a sec to read this. I think we see this a lot. So this is the framework that we developed using a lot of the theories that I've talked to you about and results of a bunch of literature, some of which I didn't have time to go into, but we call it Prepare to Adapt. And one of the things we liked about it is that the same mnemonic is designed to work with both whether you're seeking feedback or giving feedback. So you have it on both sides. And the idea is, and I'll go through it in a little bit more detail, is that you prepare for, and this is, remember, this is specifically the coaching style feedback where you're together to do something clinically. And that could even be calling for a consult, for example, so it doesn't have to be a patient interaction or whatever you guys do in lab medicine when you're looking at stuff and results from machines and things that other people just read on the computer. So an important thing is preparing for the observation, and that's where you set the goal. So if you're the learner, you might say, hey, I am really bad at X. or I think I'm not as good at X as I want to be. Can you help me with X? And if you're a coach or an attending, and that's your role, you can think about either saying, what is it that you want, that, with your upper level learners, what is it that you want me to focus on? What is it that you're struggling with? What is it that you think you need help with? And I can tell you that, I think it's part of the fact that we sort of in some ways infantilize our trainees and our environment a little bit in medicine. A lot of people, even who are very upper level trainees, do not necessarily have learning goals. And I've had PGY7s come to my clinic and say, gosh, no one's ever asked me what my learning goal was before, which may just be a function of my inadequate language abilities, but also I think is a little bit reflective of the fact that we don't ask people to do this themselves. We provide curriculum for them. But if they don't have their own learning goals, you can have a packet of learning goals that you think are useful, okay, and that you like to focus on. Like for me, I like to focus on teaching people how to interrogate a defibrillator or a pacemaker, but I also like to focus on teaching people how you do communication around implanted devices or whatever it is. So you have your things you like, the EKG reading, so you have those things, just like the little talks that you can create on rounds that are an area of interest in you, that are important for your area to cover. And once you have buy-in each other, you want to do the observation. And this, I think, is another underappreciated area of medicine that we have fallen out of the habits of direct observation. And you really need to directly observe in order to have validity for when you're telling people feedback. And I remember when Eric Holmboe, who is published a million wonderful things about feedback and works for the ACGME, when he was here a couple years ago, he described this anecdote where he said, the way that we train people in medicine is as if you were a concert pianist, you walked into a room and you closed the door and you played your whatever you were playing, and then you came out and your music teacher said, well, how'd that go? And I just laugh to think that that's so often what we do in medicine. We ask the trainee to tell us how things went, or we use our direct observation as more in their reporting rather than in what they're actually doing. And then when the observation is done, you can say, hey, how'd that go for you? Or if you're the learner, you can say, this is what I thought about my performance in this way. And if you're the performer and you don't know, you can also say, hey, what'd you think of this? And then you discuss. And hopefully there's some kind of standard you compare to. And then that important and really difficult part is the plan together. Like, okay, I didn't know X, Y, and Z, so here's the guidelines, or I'll send you this good paper, or here's this great thing that Tony Bach wrote about how you communicate with people. And I just want to see if I have any tips or tricks that I can think about. We discussed the fact that that specific coaching is sometimes really hard to elicit. And I think some of the questions that I've had about the prepare part include people struggling a bit with the idea that what do you do when you have a learner who really is doing poorly and struggling, and it's a huge blind spot for them. And so people look at this framework and they say, how can I use this? And I think that that's where you use your role as somebody who's a valued coach to say, here are some things that I see trainees struggle with, and here, this is something that I would love to be observing and working with you on. So I think that can be a very useful way to do it. We talked about the direct observation enough and validity. In terms of the other thing that's really important is the immediacy and the timeliness. Like when I do this in clinic, for example, which is easy, right after we leave the patient's room, we talk about the patient's plan as the patient's walking past the desk so that they don't hear the rest of us, and then we go into the feedback. And I used to try to do this for almost every patient, but it was impossible. So now I feel like if I get one or two little prepare to adapt things done in each half day of clinic, I'm doing pretty well. And you really want to be using this conversation to engage your learner in kind of a dialogue about their performance. You don't want to be just saying, I saw you do this. And when you do talk about your observations, it's also really useful to make sure that you're focusing on the observations themselves and not your interpretation. Like, I noticed that when you gave your presentation at lab meeting that you looked down the whole time and didn't engage the audience, as opposed to, I noticed when you gave your lab presentation that you looked nervous. Because those are more judgment calls, right? And you want to speak out with what you see rather than what you're interpreting as much as possible. And I think that helps give you credibility. The second ask is more a clarify of observations, and a lot of times, and I use this framework as just a way to help me remember to do most of the steps, but not necessarily to think of it pedantically, like you have to do, A, D, A, B, T. And it's really about the planning together. A lot of the trouble that we have with doing this kind of feedback in medical education and thinking about yourself as a coach is sometimes you don't have repeated contact with your learners. This came up a lot in the people we were working with in emergency medicine, where they do one shift with one group of people and then they were gone. I don't know if you guys have more of a kind of an apprenticeship model the way that we do. I couldn't tell from looking at the website about your training plans. So I
don't know if anyone else wants to answer, but it depends a little bit on the rotation, and I think the interactions are often on the shorter side, although there are some that are longer, so maybe a week or a couple of days rather than a full month together. Although on some rotations you will have a longer stretch of time together.
Yeah, it's nice when you do, right? Because it really does help with how your relationship is developing with people and how they can feel like you're in their corner. The other thing that so I was thinking about sort of like little tips that we give people a lot about, how you can use the framework and make it a habit. It's interesting, Tyra Feinstad, who is actually just wrapping up a project looking at feedback in the general internal medicine clinics. And what she did for this timing triggers thing is she had an administrative assistant send an email before each clinic day to the attending resident pair that said, hey, you guys are paired in clinic tomorrow. Resident, remember to come up with some kind of learning goal, pick which patient you want to have a direct observation for. And then they would have their clinic day, and then it was up to the attending to send in a little note, because this is part of a research project, that they had the feedback or they didn't have the feedback. And the attending resident pairs were randomized to having this feedback intervention versus not having it. And what they found is that, as you would expect, there's a massive increase in the number of feedback conversations that people are having when you compare the intervention and non-intervention group. And this is the sort of thing that maybe if you did have an administrator who could help you with this is great. For me, what I'll do is put a little alarm clock on my phone during the clinic day that I have with, and like feedback, so it pops up and I remember, oh yeah, I have to do that. Because even though I've been doing this for years, I still need some sort of trigger, even in my repetitive environment, to remember to do that. And I have similar kind of triggers for when I'm working with my EP fellows in the lab as well. But these are things you have to think about with respect to, how can you make this a part of your life. Another thing is this whole issue of kind of this shifting the mindset towards one that's more learning goal oriented. And I think it can be really helpful if we model for trainees our own struggles and our own vulnerabilities, and can make them feel much more comfortable in admitting to even maybe just a slight imperfection, to be able to get feedback in those areas. I think it's really helpful to explicitly teach learners about theories of feedback and why feedback and feedback-seeking behavior can be useful. And it's also really useful to differentiate for people the difference between coaching style feedback and evaluation, to say, to make sure that you have explicitly said what you expect with respect to them developing learning goals, and that you're going to give feedback during the time that you're working with them. Like, hey, this is how I work. I want to get better. I want you to get better. And we're going to do it like, this is how I suggest doing it. You let me know if that's a problem for you. So establish expectations. I have struggled a lot with the labeling thing. So you'll see in a lot of feedback talks and a lot of things you read about feedback that you should label your feedback, because over and over again, for example, on those ACGME faculty and resident surveys, the residents will say, no, I never get any feedback, and the faculty will say, I'll always give feedback. And there's this huge issue of whether people understand you're giving feedback. And so you'll hear a lot of people say, label this as feedback. And so then years ago, I read that Boud-and-Malloy book that I mentioned, and in like one of the first 2 chapters, they say, don't label feedback. It's really condescending. Like your your residents and fellows are really smart people, they're grown-ups, like you don't have to label feedback and say, I'm gonna give you some feedback. And I thought, oh, finally I found my people, this is how I feel. And then I found that people don't know that you're giving them feedback. it's just really, so I try to do it like in sort of a non like big deal, high stakes way that, hey, let me give you some feedback, or let's talk about feedback, or why don't you get, like I use the word now in a way that I didn't 3 or 4 years ago. So I'm back on the bandwagon of labeling. And, you know, it's interesting because we had a visiting a scholar come and talk with us about feedback and sort of the psychology of responding to feedback. And one of the points that she made was that perception is everything. So that if you hone somebody's focus into, you know, this is actually feedback that you can use, information that you can use to make your performance better, then it can be very useful. Another thing that I often use is the milestones. So you guys have a million different milestones. I'm so sorry. And I feel bad for an internal medicine for the opposite way. So we have internal medicine and we have the 17 or so specialties, and I'm a subspecialty and have the same milestones that I evaluate people on as general internal medicine, which doesn't work great either. And I looked at like 6 or 7 of your guys' milestones, and there's some really interesting things, like, you know, learning how to do audits of a lab. And there's a lot of stuff in there in the professionalism and communication sections that I think are outstanding that we could really use in cardiology about how you manage your clinical environment in lab medicine. So if you look at those, that can sometimes help you. Because what I find is that when I'm having fellows who are struggling, that the problem is not usually the patient care medical knowledge part. It's usually things like the professionalism and the interpersonal communication skills. And when you run into that problem, sometimes using the language of the milestones can give you a standard that is very objective and can be useful to have these conversations taken down an emotional notch. So those are just some of the ways that we can get around the issue. One of the main things that we were hoping to do with the feedback framework is to make it kind of efficient and easy. And that framework can work for longer conversations if you're sitting down with somebody and talking to them for a while, but it really does work for just I'm walking down the hallway here and we're gonna talk about this thing we just did. And I think it really, it's incredibly useful to use the framework to remind yourself to allow the learner to identify the areas that they want to progress on. But I think most of all, just making the effort. I think that can go a long way in terms of letting your trainees know that you're there for them and there for them to do better. And we're all there for them to do better so that we can do better at taking care of people. And we're all here because we really care about that. So I was emailing a little bit with Sindhu and who also talked with Lori Soma about kind of like what would be some scenarios that you would run into that you want to get feedback on. And they sent me some outstanding ones, really outstanding ones. So I thought I would just sort of go through a few of them and to see what you guys thought. I think I have like 20 minutes, right, total? But I should probably give some time for questions. So I love this because this happens to me all the time. So you're a faculty member and you see that there are mistakes on documentation for reports, you know, or the grammar really sucks and you're having to correct that, and spelling errors and you can't figure out why, and you say this, and it just keeps happening. So what do you do? Thoughts? Anything about anything I said that would make you think about how you might handle that?
Talk to them about each one of their errors, like go over the reports with them.
You could do what you do with kids and set a positive goal. Like we're gonna create some visibility around this, and if over the course of these 2 weeks you have no errors, then we'll pick up screen time.
Yeah. Because everyone loves screen time. Absolutely. And I mean, I think of this as being a really good one for, you know, a sidelight of direct observation, right? Like if I'm sitting there in my office correcting people's reports and I'm like steaming because I'm having to do all this, I can send whatever a nasty email I can think of to my fellow to let them know, but all they get is a nasty email. Where if I sit down with them and say, let's go over this together so you can kind of see what I'm aiming for in terms of report and talk to you about why that's important. It makes a huge difference when they have to sit there and watch you correcting spelling and sort of making sure that you've got all the components that are important for your documentation that you need in there. And I think it can be a really good learning experience. This is in every area of medicine, right? Like, you heard from someone, either a staff member or someone in your lab, that a trainee was really nasty. And yeah, these are hard. Any thoughts about these?
Just talk to them about the situation. What happened? I think usually we have a good idea of whether this was likely a miscommunication or if this person has a history of doing things like that.
All right, I'll try to repeat it. So talk to them. And I think that's so important. And I think that you also brought up a really important point that's with respect to how we approach these things is it's super easy to make the fundamental attribution error, right? And it's super easy to get mad when you hear these stories like, oh my God, that is my favorite tech. She worked so hard. How could that person have been so nasty? When you don't really know until you've gotten the information. So that's when you want to, bring the person in, sit down for coffee and say, hey, I witnessed this or I heard this or whatever it was in terms of that particular, what was going on? Like, I'm just sort of trying to get this together. And it's really amazing how often you hear very different stories. And then you sort of have to figure out, how much and what kind of feedback you're going to give that person with respect to, to open their mind to the idea that maybe a particular wording was a problem. And you're totally right in your second point too, I think, or commensurate with my experience, that that there's a big difference between a one-off and a pattern of behavior. And those are really different conversations with respect to sometimes you can let one-offs go. Particularly if it's someone you're not working with. One of the scenarios that that Sindhu sent was, you overhear something. It's not someone you usually work with. In those particular cases, depending on how egregious what you overheard was, it may not work for you to come down and talk to somebody who doesn't know who you are, who you don't have a relationship with, and you might be better off going to the program director and saying, or sending an email saying, hey, just wanted to let you know this happened. That being said, as a program director, I'm just going to step right up there and say it drives me nutso when all feedback is supposedly comes through me. I don't have enough credibility in the universe to tell all of my fellows all of the things that everyone else is seeing about them. So I work really hard to try to encourage, even in critical conversations, that direct feedback comes from other people besides me. But there is a time and place for you not being the person who addresses that, and those can be complicated. Yeah.
I wonder, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I wonder if any trainees have suggestions about what would be a good way to respond to this, either of these two?
I'm looking over in the vague area where the hands were raised of being trainees. Anyone have any ideas of how they'd like to be approached?
If you feel comfortable doing so, sitting down the trainee with the technologist and yourself to mediate it? If you feel comfortable doing so, sitting down with the trainee and the technologist to mediate between them, explain their differences in the perception of the interaction, would be helpful in understanding your impact on other people's kind of experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think these things it's just, for me, I find sometimes it's just a time issue, right? Like, how are you going to remember to get together with that person and this person? And it's all about, how important it is and how, and sometimes you have to do a little bit of fact-finding before you decide what the intervention should be. I thought this was an interesting one, and I thought it was really applicable to different subspecialties as well, is what happens when you see that there's misdropped information in patient handoffs or follow-up? What do you do about that situation?
I mean, that seems almost easier to me because there's a natural consequence to dropping the ball, right?
So almost easier to you because it's a natural consequence.
It's a natural consequence of it appears that you failed to sign this out and here's what happened. Right?
Is that always so obvious?
It is in your scenario.
Well, I mean, I think about it. Sometimes what happens is like, let's say for me, a patient's anticoagulation doesn't get stopped before a procedure. Or for you guys, maybe it's that a patient had a critical value of a test and it didn't happen. I don't think that information always gets back to the person who was supposed to deal with it. I think that can be a structurally difficult thing.
Yeah. The laboratory medicine dogma, at least that we're taught, is in a situation like this, first you look for the the system, the problem in the system, and that only after you rule out the possibility or the likelihood or almost the certainty that there's some kind of systematic problem do you treat this as an error that is necessarily attributable to an individual's failings. So that I would tend to think, well, it's probably really easy to miss a handoff because like you said, there's a lot going on, and the system doesn't lend itself to good communication.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think these are really great things to identify for your quality improvements. What can we do to make sure that this, as opposed to you didn't follow through on every single thing, kind of a more broad evaluation of, how are handoffs happening? And that's another place for direct observation. Like, what are my trainees doing to hand off this information to the next person so that things don't fall out, so that by observation what's really going on in your own system. I mean, I don't know how things work and you have so many systems within this room, but a lot of stuff happens without me really knowing how it happens for even my group. And I think sometimes it's surprising when you're like, oh, it takes 47 emails for you guys to do that. We should think about it. And trainees are so great, right? They're so used to being accommodating and working really hard. They do their best in really not very optimally designed systems. And you can really pick that up when you talk to them about, what happened in which way. So those were my objectives. So we talked about the types of feedback, the appreciation and the coaching style feedback and evaluation, and we talked a ton about the benefits of seeking feedback and a lot about the learning environment and relationship and some about the framework as well. I do want to let you know that the framework itself is on the website that I have up here, and I think the slides are going to be distributed to you guys. In addition to the framework itself, we have 2 modules that we've developed that were mostly developed for trainees and early career people. One of them is a feedback seeker module, and one is a coaching module that's newer. Both of those modules are like, 10 minutes, not very long, that just sort of go through some of the underlying theory about feedback giving and seeking, and a little bit of tips and tricks about how you might employ it yourself in your practice. But I thought I'd leave a few minutes for questions.
Thanks very much. That was great. I wanted to move back to a topic you brought up, and I sort of just wanted you to talk a little bit more about it because we moved on faster than I would have hoped. The issue specifically of, this is very annoying, the ACGME survey question about getting feedback and how we, like I imagine maybe other programs maybe like yours, get dinged on that. And then the question of, is it condescending to tell people that you're giving them feedback, to say, well, if they just knew they were getting feedback, maybe more of them would rate that they're getting feedback. I hear what you're saying. I think it is condescending to do that. Some of us do that. Some of us don't do that. It seems to be, though, that one of the reasons why I think maybe we shouldn't tell people who are giving feedback is, even if it is condescending, it also doesn't work because people still say that they're not getting feedback. How do we get that question answered more? I think that there's parts of it are that sometimes the perception, this is just my own thoughts, that sometimes if people don't like feedback, they say that they don't get feedback. They don't like the feedback they're getting. Or if there's a culture, a perceived culture where feedback is discouraged or threatening, then even if people get feedback, they'll still respond to a question, are you getting feedback, with, no, I'm not getting feedback. Even though I'm getting some, it just is a creepy sort of feedback vibe. What are your thoughts about that specific question? Because I understand it's pervasive across, I know in talking as an ex-program director and talking to other programs across the country in pathology lab medicine, but also probably well across our own GME here, it's pervasive. What can we do to address that specific issue?
Yeah, it's a great question and a very, very multi-layered one. And for one thing, actually, it is true that it was the UW's GME overall poor responses to that question that led to the development of this entire project. So part of the way I would respond to you with respect to how can we get these up is to figure out a way to use the framework to get more feedback going, okay? And you can label it or not label it as you like. And I think some of the more sophisticated ways you might think about approaching feedback with trainees and upper level trainees is things like, I want to make sure that you're getting the feedback that you need. What ways do you think are useful? You can find other words if you don't like that particular word. Like I said, I have gone back and forth about this, and I'm finding that in general, I think there is a use for, in my experience, there is a usefulness, particularly with some trainees who are a little bit more concrete, to label it and to talk about it. And maybe it's not even, I don't necessarily say, hey, I'm going to give you some feedback. It's more, let's think about the feedback process and make sure that they understand that I'm thinking about feedback for them. And so therefore it shifts you more in the direction of, oh, when she's saying things to me about my clinical performance, that's meant to be feedback. So at least you have kind of trained yourself into thinking of it in that way. And I think you can be more or less subtle, and that's all useful. I can tell you that, and this is a tiny sample size, the answer to that question when the fellows are asked about working with me on rotations in general cardiology and EP, it has skyrocketed in the last few years where I have been focused on this. So it has really made an impact whether I said feedback or not. And my written comments actually very surprising, maybe not surprisingly often, specifically call out the fact that they get feedback from me, they appreciate getting feedback from me, and they appreciate the kind of feedback. So I've sort of tracked some element of success without having good numerical data on that.
So I wonder if you could comment on differences or value of direct feedback and anonymous feedback, which I see a lot of heads nodding.
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. Because we've thought a lot about upwards feedback as well as peer feedback. And in the ACGME environment, our feedback to fellows is non-confidential, but our fellows' feedback to us is designed to be confidential to protect them. And I think that what happens, I think that we are promulgating a culture in which we don't have the skills to be able to give each other feedback. So, for example, when we're in, how often do your peers ask you for feedback, or how often do you give feedback? Like, let's say that I wish I had better examples for lab medicine, but like, for example, in our clinic, if I hear from a patient that they had a really bad experience with one of my peers who I know is an outstanding doctor, do I just let that go? Do I tell them if I see a pattern of that particular kind of communication thing? When do I address it, and how do I address it? And how do I do it skillfully in a way that's going to preserve the relationship? These are really hard. We sort of have moved a little bit in this intersection between feedback and kind of critical or crucial conversations and how teams work. And I honestly don't have a very good answer for you. I think anonymous feedback is tough because you can't really understand the person who's giving you that feedback can't, like, for example, you overhear someone saying something nasty to someone, you don't know the prior interaction unless you have a direct conversation. So I struggle a lot with indirect or anonymous feedback, but I don't really know how to make trainees comfortable with it, because medicine is so hierarchical. Like, I totally understand why people don't want to tell me that I sucked at XYZ. Was that at all an answer? No.
It's hard.
Yes, it's hard.
Along those lines, I think one of the obstacles that I have noted for people to give and receive feedback is this trust, and there's this issue that the feedback is going to be essentially used against them, or that if they give constructive or negative feedback, that it could lead to retaliation. And so that this seems to be somewhat pervasive, and it really makes objective evaluations and actually trying to be constructive and helping with performance issues quite complicated when you have everyone that's really pretty much the anonymous issue is the same thing. I mean, anonymous confidentiality. We don't have uniform trust, I think, amongst individuals that these things can be done in an open manner without the potential harm.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's really nuanced, isn't it? And there's also, I think, because a lot of this we were thinking about with respect when we were making the framework with respect to how do you develop a relationship, and we were using the coaching model as a shortcut to help develop some of that trust between the trainee and the attending. One thing that I think is possible is that there's a big difference between the majority of learners and how they respond to feedback and a subset of people who may be more defensive. And I mean, everybody's got some, we're all defensive, right? But like there's the problem person who may be way more defensive or have higher walls or be somebody who is more likely to retaliate. And I think that's a huge problem and that's not going to be solved by any framework at all. But I do think most trainees, it was funny, I had this conversation with a couple of friends recently talking about this whole issue of, how do you give critical feedback in an environment where your promotional pathway is dependent on showing that you have good teaching evaluations. This comes up all the time. You were wondering if I was going to address it, weren't you? And I think there's no good answer to this. I mean, for one thing, I personally think that teaching evaluations are not necessarily reflective of somebody's utility as a teacher, how good they are. I think it's a bad metric, not quite as bad as patient satisfaction scores, but probably close. But I also think that we've all learned from people who were hypercritical and really great and loved them, right? Like we've all had experiences in medical education where someone maybe didn't deliver feedback very skillfully to you and you still worshiped the ground that they walked on because you knew they were right and they were telling you the right thing. And I think a lot of people in medicine are like that and can hear things well, And what's interesting is when we started doing we've done a qualitative research project around the framework. And what was funny was to hear, in the interviews, the fellows and residents expressing how sometimes critical feedback, they didn't listen at the time or they were just troubled by it at the time. And it wasn't until later where they really started, and that could be years later, where they really started thinking about it and used it to change their behavior or their attitude. So I agree with you that this is hugely nuanced. And I think part of part of this whole culture thing has to be a way in which we allow for the fact that there are some trainees that aren't going to be happy with you if you're critical of them, and that can't affect your professional advancement. And I think that can be anything from the fact that, if most of your scores are good and you have a few outliers, we all understand that and we all have that. And I think in general, when you look overall at those MedHub evaluations of teachers, we're all in that category of fantastic. It's like there's almost no variation. So, and yet we all have this small subset of people who are not happy with us. I think the system largely gets by, but I think if there are specific circumstances, especially in what we all have, which are small training programs with not very many people, that those sometimes have to be handled by a case-by-case basis.
I was just going to go back to this idea of whether we should use the word feedback, in order to let trainees know that it's happening. And I think you hit on a really important idea that trainees are really infantilized, that we were in training for so many years of our life and everything revolved around grades, scores, and rankings. And so I think sometimes when they're thinking about feedback, they want to hear, how am I doing in respect to my peers? What grade would you give me? So the little things that we consider feedback, when you finally get to be an adult and nobody's grading you anymore, they're not used to hearing that as being feedback. They just want this sort of overall. And so I think if we can cultivate more of that's what you should expect as feedback, rather than, am I better than everybody else, or am I at the bottom, or whatever, that might be helpful. So I think using the word feedback is probably useful there, because I think they might have a different definition.
Yeah, I totally agree, obviously. And I think that really does speak to this whole idea of talking about feedback routinely, or talking about performance routinely, improvement routinely. Like, I make sure that my fellows who work with me know, and I make them watch, or I do it in front of them, where I like look at the guidelines that I should know by now, by heart. I look them up to make sure that I am using the data correctly, or we do, searches together so that they know that, yeah, I may know that, there's that mineralization is because of calcium apatite buildup at the lead interface, and, they may think, oh my God, she knows everything, but I don't. And I make it really clear that I don't know everything, and that I look up stuff all the time as part of my goal to, continually learn more about what I'm doing.
I think we've already probably beat this a little bit as far as how to mitigate risk, both from the trainee providing, let's say, verbal rather than written, or the, let's say, the junior faculty to the trainee. Any other ideas on how, like, approaches to mitigate that, or like third-party filters, whether that's another individual in the room, a chief resident, a program director, or before transmitting the written evaluations, have them be reviewed?
Yeah, I think those are a really good, I think that's a good thing. And again, I want to kind of separate, because I think it's come up a couple of times now, the idea between, there's a difference between your kind of off-the-cuff coaching feedback that you're doing, assuming that, on kind of a small thing, just so that they have something to work on, and remediating a problem. And I think that some of this doesn't happen except for in this area of there are recurrent problems that are not responding to feedback, and those are going to be conversations that need to be had skillfully and carefully with sometimes more than one person. I actually had a situation with a fellow a couple of years ago where I used the UW embed to help me with that fellow's problem. So there are all kinds of crazy resources here that you wouldn't even know about in this giant university. All right, thank you so much, everyone.